States feels towards justifying the genocide and the massacre of 40,000 Palestinians plus. It's absurd.
My point is, you're sitting here in the West and you're speaking freely. Where is the place that you think does it better than we do here?
I think it's important to recognize that this...
No, but where is the place? I mean, it's a simple question. It's just the name of a country.
I recognize the privilege I have of saying whatever I want in Qatar.
Right, so this is the best place in the world for
Qatar.
speech.
I don't know, that's my personal experience.
I don't think anyone said that.
Like times in the West, I would feel afraid.
So why don't you go somewhere and speak somewhere where it's better to speak?
We do a lot of these town halls in Qatar.
If you love peaceful chaos and intelligent confrontations, you need to see what Konstantin did to this group of Muslim activists during panel discussion. While they threw around buzzwords, victim cards, and selective history, he kept asking one devastating question after another. The result was pure intellectual carnage that feels so satisfying to watch. Let's begin with what this Sudanese student said about Europe that would literally jar your ears.
So let's go to the left now, to Isra, and just keep the microphone as close as possible to your mouth.
Hi, I'd firstly like to thank all our guests. I think that a lot of the points that I'll be bringing up resonate with what you said. But I'd like to also touch on a point that Raid also raised. I think that when Fatima mentioned all the West, all of Europe, I'm from Albania, and I think that the umbrella term of Western narrative sort of makes the other communities and the other narratives within the West get lost. This year marks the 80th anniversary of the genocide committed by Greece on Albanian people, which is another Western genocide happening in Europe. And using the term Western narrative and all the West and all of Europe, do you think that sort of emphasizes and adds to that narrative that us versus them, West versus the rest?
I mean, I'm curious, Ramona, just to ask both of you, what would you prefer? I mean, how do you see things?
So I view narrative.
That speaker brought up some obscure historical grievance to paint the West as uniquely evil.
So in the sense that rather than a top-down sort of Foucaultian power drives everything sort of postmodern way of thinking, I think that the way narratives are created are in fact not created by a manufacturing consenting elite, but rather by multiple different people in society, very pluralistic. As I said earlier, the way that Konstantin will view the West is different than how you would view the West. However, you're both subscribing to Western ways of thinking when you critique the West or support the West. So when you say the West can't support global justice, not only are you assuming that there is such thing as a West in an IR sense, which again isn't true, because the interests of the United States and France are completely different, and the values of the United States and France are different as well. But you're also assuming a global South, which doesn't exist either, because there's no uniform consent between China and the Middle East and Africa. They have no common interests or value systems together. In fact, you're orientalizing both the West and the East by creating those sort of terms. So that's how I view this sort of debate today.
I think we can go.
You see, America and France have totally different interests. China, the Middle East, and Africa aren't some united bloc either. By pushing these cartoonish us versus them stories, they were actually orientalizing both sides. It is a polite but brutal takedown of the whole intellectual framework they were standing on. Now listen to the honest but twisted question this Sudanese student asked.
Is Mimi McCrary, and I am a student at Georgetown University, and I would kind of just like to raise a different point. I feel like I don't necessarily view or kind of pinpoint the Western narrative or, the West, but rather that states, whether that be in the East, are always working to promote their own justices, not even their justices, but their own self-interests. And you mentioned a lot that we can actually rely on the West. But for me, the way that I view it as a Sudanese woman is, number one, we view, for instance, within the region, this kind of pan-Arab or pan-African brotherhood. And when I'm looking at states such as the United Arab Emirates, who there have been claims in which I truly believe that they are funding our militia currently, who is in a war against the Sudanese armed forces. So when you have things such as United Arab Emirates who are working within their own state's interest and kind of going on the media and saying that they're, investing in Sudan, and then also having countries such as China who are building a lot of bridges, and now we're having this loan debt. So if we can't, rely on the West, then who can we rely on? Can we rely on the East? Because in the end of the day, I view both the fact that there is a Western narrative, but there's also an Eastern narrative. So do we depend on independent journalists? Do we depend on, the people, on, civic organizations? Who do you want us to depend on?
She was clearly thinking practically instead of ideologically. But that kind of clear-eyed questioning is, most people just absorb whatever narrative is pushed at them. Notice how this response will expose the emptiness of her anti-Western rhetoric.
The transatlantic footlegs of this are very narcissistic. We don't care, to be honest, about most of the topics you just raised, except as how they affect us. So when I love the quote that you mentioned a moment ago about history and who controls history, you have to understand history is negotiated. Most people walk around with a gauzy idea that somehow there's some real truth of history. There's not. It's a it's a function of power relationships that's constantly negotiated. China is renegotiating its place in the world and how it's dealt with because it's become a powerful nation. The United States is seeing its power challenge. So I just want to throw that out there. It's a much more dynamic system, and sometimes that system isn't pluralistic. Sometimes it all runs in a direction. Doesn't mean to say that there aren't other voices out there that are important, but it's very hard for them to get any oxygen.
But Steve, with all respect to you, I mean, you're describing human psychology. Human beings are prone to panics and to mass movements and delusions and whatever. But if you're challenging the young man's point about pluralism, where is this beautiful utopian pluralistic society out of the United States competitors? Are we talking about Russia or China or Gulf monarchies? Where is this beautiful pluralistic world to which we're all aspiring?
Did you notice how the panel kept trying to paint the West as uniquely hypocritical and narcissistic? The beautiful thing is Konstantin flipped it completely. The key difference is that the West at least allows you to criticize it openly. It's easy to bash the West when you're enjoying its freedoms. Try doing the same thing in the places they romanticize.
Bring in again our on-stage
Denmark.
audience.
I'm joking. Yeah. No, I mean, you make a good point, but I mean, yeah.
I agree.
Great, let's bring in some more voices. Tamim.
Yes, I'm Tamim Yunus. I'm a recent graduate from Northwestern University in Qatar. I really resonate with what Fatma said, and I think for the sake of this town hall, we are talking about the West. Obviously, there are issues with Russia and China and other places in the world with how they run things, but it's really important to recognize facts of what has been happening for decades in mainstream narrative, Western narratives. And this is where we really need to consider about counter narratives, right? We talked about how, it's the West by the West, but there were so many times where counter narratives rose up, but they get silenced. And that's where imperialist powers put in what they do. You think of Julian Assange, and a case study that really resonates with me is Dr. Ghazan Abu Sitta, who's British Palestinian, who saw the genocide taking place in Gaza, went back to Europe, tried to talking about it in Germany. They banned him. And then they banned him in France. They didn't allow him to talk to students. They attempted to do that virtually. If the West truly cares about what it claims to focus on, it wouldn't do that. And same happens in TV and everywhere. And we saw right now that when channels like Al Jazeera tries to have a base within the settler colony Zionist regime, it gets banned and people get silenced. And there are certain factions I can't even mention because I will be banned from this country. And that's the truth. These people are not being platformed. They have a side. They have been so stigmatized that we cannot even talk about it.
Okay, thank you. I want to bring in Hannah.
Hi everyone, my name is Hannah Shihabi. I'm a recent graduate from Georgetown University in Qatar. Steve, I actually wanted to hone in on some of the points that you raised. I think I really appreciate the nuance you brought forward about, the designations between institutions, states, nations. But I think in terms of the values directing the framing of the Western narrative and the media at large, the question is, who are these values for? So let's take an example of what's happening in Gaza, for instance. 40 beheaded babies is falsified completely, no accountability on that front. The US facilitates an Israeli-led operation in the Nusayrat refugee camp in June of this year, and that's framed as a rescue operation and not a massacre. In that sense, who are these values for? So who are these values for when it comes to the coverage? And in terms of the rest of the rest of the world outside of the West, are these values applied there, or are they strictly confined to the West? Thank you.
Her question is pointed, and at the same time, a bait to provocation. Notice how it sits heavily in the room, until Konstantin dispelled that heaviness with just one sentence.
No country has an obligation to have enemy propaganda broadcast into it. It doesn't mean they don't believe in free speech. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union did not allow the American press into the Soviet Union, and America didn't allow the Soviet press into America. It's a pretty normal thing to do because when you're at war, the aim is survival, and it's widely accepted that wartime things are a little bit different. But again, I put the point to you. Where is this better society? Where is a society that practices free speech in the way that you'd like?
Okay, Tamim, yes.
Yeah, I think we really also need to ask ourselves who defines what that propaganda is, right? And it's not fair because we've seen it all the time in apartheid South Africa and even segregation during the United States, in the United States and so forth. A lot of these voices were shut down. There was a time, right, when the Holocaust happened, that happened for a reason, because people were shut up. That propaganda was so widespread, and you're saying just because these countries were at war that somehow that justifies it. And the genocide against Gaza, is that really the war of the United States? What we could go into the obligation the United States feels towards justifying the genocide and the massacre of 40,000 Palestinians plus. It's absurd.
My point is, you're sitting here in the West and you're speaking freely. Where is the place that you think does it better than we do here?
I think it's important to recognize that this...
No, but where is the place? I mean, it's a simple question. It's just the name of a country.
I recognize the privilege I have of saying whatever I want in Qatar.
Right, so this is the best place in the world for
Qatar.
speech.
I don't know, that's
no.
my personal
I
experience.
don't think anyone said that.
Like, my experience, that's true. It depends on everyone's own personal experience. In my case, that is.
Okay.
I was shut down so many times in the West. I would feel afraid.
So why don't you go somewhere and speak
States,
somewhere where it's better to speak?
We do a lot of these town halls in Qatar and we say whatever we want.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm just telling you.
So Qatar is better on free speech, you would say?
And what I have experienced, right, I live in every single part of the world.
But that's
and
because of what you're saying.
Okay, but we're not talking about Russia. Obviously, I recognize Russia has a lot of the problem, and like you said, China. But that's not the point of this town hall right now. I really would love to have a town hall focused.
Even the next guy on the left is visibly frustrated by his senseless tirade. Konstantin didn't have to ask the obvious, but he did anyway, to teach the gullible Muslim a lesson.
And China and their imperialist and horrible crimes against humanity, but I think we don't have enough time for that, so let's not divert.
Would you say that Usain Bolt is fast or slow?
Sorry?
Usain Bolt, the sprinter, is he fast or is he slow?
He's fast.
How do you know? By comparing him to other people, right? The same is true about speech, the same is true of everything. Everything is understood by comparing it to others. There are 6 great civilizations in the world. Western Christian civilization, Eastern Christian civilization, the 2 Islamic civilizations, the Chinese civilization, and the Indian civilization. In which of those civilizations would you rather live than the one that you are speaking in now? That's got nothing to do with the point about speech.
Let's hold on to this, but it's good that we're getting a bit warmed up, I would say, on the floor. So as you saw in our video earlier, there are more restrictions on free speech in some parts of the West. Take, for example, Denmark, which has restricted religious speech in the name of anti-radicalization. According to a recent report, the UK's 2023 Online Safety Act could inadvertently suppress some kinds of lawful speech. Are there things that we shouldn't be allowed to say? Now, we asked our onstage audience for their opinions on limiting free speech. So let's take a look at what you all think. So there's some interesting findings there. Some of you are free speech absolutists, and quite a few of you actually lean in that direction. But a couple of you see value in limiting some kinds of free speech. To the speakers, does any of that surprise you?
Well, there's a thing economists called revealed preference versus actual preference. So to the extent that this is true or not, we don't know until we test some cases, right? And I think we may find the different picture as we do.
Yeah, I mean, I think...
You see, no country has to broadcast enemy propaganda, especially during conflict. And watching Konstantin refuse to let them dodge the comparison was comedy gold.
We're here talking about the West, and all that we've done so far is to say where's better. You know, I think it's diversionary. I think it's distracting. We're not talking about the entire world. We're talking about the West right now. I thought it was hilarious to see Douglas Murray on stage. It's usually hilarious when you hear Douglas Murray, but I thought it was wonderful to hear him say the West is a place where everyone's personal liberty is respected. Unless, of course, you say from the river to the sea. Unless, of course, you talk about what is happening in Gaza, and you don't frame it automatically as something that started immediately on October 7th. Unless, of course, you're in France and you happen to want to wear a keffiyeh or a hijab. Free speech absolutists like Douglas Murray, I guess that's what he calls himself, have a great amount of freedom for themselves, but very little freedom for people who don't look, sound, and mimic them, it seems to me.
I'm friends with Douglas. I've never heard him describe himself as a free speech absolutist. And as for your point about, and we saw it in the clips earlier, about you can't display a Palestine flag, I've been to several pro-Palestine protests which are documented on our YouTube channel with people saying whatever the hell they want, up to and including that October 7th was a false flag operation, etc. People are free to do so. I invite people to go to Russia and say that the invasion of Ukraine was a mistake or was wrong or is immoral or illegal. They will be immediately locked up. So it's not a distraction to say, where are these other societies? Everything is understood in terms of what is available to you, right? What is available to you in the spectrum of freedom, where is better than the West? That's the question.
Look, what we're arguing about is that with free expression is also coming a packaged intolerance for those that are deciding. This gets into what's called the woke debate or being canceled. And I have to tell you, as someone who has a significant other in academia, how many...
Notice how the panel got reduced to repeating slogans while Konstantin kept returning to first principles. He showed what true pluralism means, being able to criticize any civilization, including your own, without fear. The others wanted the benefits of Western openness while rejecting its core values. That contradiction is why these debates always collapse when someone like Konstantin shows up.
In the so-called Western system are scared for their jobs if they accidentally trip over an incorrect word. I think that's a problem.
Sure.
Because the debate is masked as one as free speech, but it's actually weaponized in a way to actually create significant consequences. So as you swim through that, we need to think, I think, more broadly, what kind of conversation opens people's aperture as opposed to narrowing the aperture? How do we have uncomfortable conversations as the norm rather than comforting conversations that just buffet our own biases? That is really what we're talking about today. And free speech somehow becomes a weapon in that debate. And we have to look at what is the balanced way for a social system to navigate something that doesn't create high consequences for those who do engage in free speech, but yet you still maintain sensitivities for those who have alternative views.
And we've seen countries like Germany and France restricting pro-Palestinian protests. And we've also witnessed a wave of crackdowns on student protests across the US and Europe. Can I just bring in some of the student voices now? I want to go to some of the free speech absolutists first, very briefly. Isra, just go ahead.
I just like to say that these kind of spaces are what make me a free speech absolutist, because we see different opinions coming together. We see a sort of market of ideas where we're able to see everything that is happening, understand it from each other's perspectives, and then at the end we get to choose what we want to believe in and what we don't want to. And I think that what we see now in Western societies, or let's say Western Europe or in North America, is that during these past 10 months that the genocide in Gaza has been unfolding, we see that Western politics and Western media have had a very critical eye on the pro-Palestine views. However, the society itself has had a public opinion shift where we see the biggest pro-Palestine protests happening now in US and UK. And I think that what I want to ask the guests today is, do you think that this shows that Western media has some sort of governmental agenda rather than merely reflecting the public opinion in it?
Do I think Western...
I watched a lot of these panels, and this one stands out because Konstantin didn't play their game. He didn't moralize or get angry. He just made logical statements that exposed how shallow a lot of the anti-Western rhetoric really is. The panel came armed with historical grievances, selective outrage, and big abstract terms. Konstantin brought clarity and consistency. The result was a masterclass in how to destroy bad ideas without raising your voice.
Mental agenda. No, I don't. On this particular issue, I'm someone who's very pro-Ukrainian, for example, but I have to say that I think on that issue, Western media hasn't given the opposite view enough of an airing for my liking, even though as someone who disagrees with that point of view. I think on the Israel-Palestine thing, I can't turn on Piers Morgan's show without seeing someone shouting genocide, genocide, genocide. The next day it's someone shouting Israel, Israel, Israel. I think the debate about Israel and Palestine has been pretty robust in the West, both in mainstream media and in new media. You know, I've had everyone from Norman Finkelstein to Bassem Youssef to all sorts of other people on my show. And pro-Israel voices as well. I think actually this particular issue has been well covered in Western media, in my opinion.
I think the one exception, though, that I would just...
What frustrates me most is how often we see this pattern. Activists living comfortably in the West spend all their time criticizing it, while staying strangely silent about far worse abuses elsewhere. They demand tolerance, but offer none in return. They romanticize resistance abroad, but freak out when someone questions their own sacred narratives at home. Konstantin showed how weak that position really is when held up to basic scrutiny.
That are eroding that territory.
Can I just bring in Hannah from the student audience? Thanks.
Very briefly, I just wanted to add on to some of the points that Steve raised. I think I just want to ask you to look a little bit beyond things on an individual level and questioning whether individuals are able to exercise their right to free speech in different places around the world, and look at it top down in terms of the institutions themselves and the power that they've managed to amass and the coverage they've managed to gain across the world. How are they using that responsibility to build narratives around other places in the world, considering that the West is a self-proclaimed gatekeeper of democracy, human rights, and justice? How do these values operate in their coverage of other places in the world on a mass media level, rather than looking at the question of whether individuals are able to exercise their right to free speech in the West or in other places in the world?
Well, if you're complaining about the West being powerful, I understand your complaint because the West is powerful, but I'd quite like it to stay that way because I think our values are better. But rare not of agreement with...
The West isn't perfect. In fact, it's far from it. But it remains one of the few places where you can have these conversations at all. The fact that these students could stand up and criticize it so freely proves the strength of the system they love to attack. Their inability to name a single better alternative says everything. This is why moments like this go viral. People are tired of the scripted outrage and selective blindness. They want honesty, even when it's uncomfortable. Konstantin delivered exactly that and left the panel with nowhere to hide. What did you think of Konstantin's approach? Did he destroy their arguments, or was there something they said that actually landed? Kindly let us know in the comments.